January 1944. A cold morning settles over the American South. Thin frost clinging to wooden rail platforms as a military train exhales steam into the pale light. The doors open slowly. Boots touch unfamiliar ground. Among the men stepping down is a German general. His greatcoat is worn. His posture still precise. Years of command sit in the way he holds his shoulders. He has crossed an ocean not as a diplomat, not as an ally, but as a prisoner of war. Beyond the wire, the world feels wrong. The camp is quiet, orderly, clean. Guards stand alert but relaxed. Barracks are solid, not temporary. Food smells drift in the air. Real food, plentiful food. There is no rubble here. No smoke columns, no hollowed cities. The general pauses. He looks past the fences. Beyond them, roads stretch freely. Trains move on time. Civilian trucks pass without blackout covers. Nothing here looks like a nation fighting for survival. This is not the America he was warned about. And as the camp gates close behind him, a deeper realization begins to form, one that will not come from interrogation rooms or documents, but from simply observing a country at war that does not appear exhausted. That moment cannot be understood without first understanding how the world reached this point. By the time German generals began arriving on American soil as prisoners of war, the war they believed they were fighting no longer existed in the form they remembered. In early 1943, the illusion of inevitability began to fracture. At Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army ceased to exist as a fighting force. More than 200,000 men were lost, killed, captured, or frozen into the ruins of a city that had become a symbol of overreach. For senior officers across the Wehrmacht, Stalingrad was not only a military disaster, it was a psychological rupture. From that point forward, Germany was no longer advancing. It was reacting. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces pushed west with growing confidence, fueled by manpower, production, and a willingness to absorb losses on a scale Germany could no longer match. In North Africa, the Axis position collapsed entirely by May 1943. Tunisia fell. More than 250,000 German and Italian troops were captured. Among them were experienced officers, men who had once believed the Mediterranean could be held indefinitely. The war closed in from every direction. In July 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. Within weeks, Mussolini was removed from power. Italy, Germany's principal European ally, would soon change sides. For the German High Command, this was a strategic earthquake. New fronts opened. Existing fronts weakened. Resources were stretched thin across a continent already scarred by years of war. Meanwhile, the air war over Germany intensified with a relentlessness no previous campaign had matched. British bombers struck by night. American bombers followed by day. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and later Berlin burned in cycles of destruction. Factories were damaged, repaired, then hit again. Civilian morale faltered. Industrial output continued, but at a growing human cost. Yet inside Germany, senior officers were still surrounded by a controlled narrative. Reports were filtered. Failures were softened. Enemy capabilities were consistently underestimated. American society, in particular, was portrayed as decadent, racially divided, and lacking the discipline required for sustained war. Nazi propaganda insisted that the United States could produce in volume, but not in quality, that Americans would grow tired, that democracy would fracture under pressure. For many generals, this narrative went unchallenged, not because they were naive, but because their world had narrowed. They commanded from field headquarters, bunkers, and ruined towns. Their view of the enemy came through aerial photographs, intercepted radio traffic, and combat reports written by exhausted subordinates. America itself remained distant and abstract. A factory name on a document, a number in a production table, a silhouette on a briefing map. Capture changed that abstraction into something immediate. High-ranking German officers were taken prisoner in several waves. Some were captured in North Africa in 1943. Others fell into Allied hands after the collapse of Italy. Still others were taken during the Normandy campaign and the subsequent fighting in France in 1944. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's final gamble in December 1944, would add more generals to the list. These men were not sent to the same camps as enlisted soldiers. Under the Geneva Convention, officers were entitled to different treatment. They were separated, housed in specialized facilities, in some cases, deliberately isolated from lower-ranking prisoners. The Allies understood the value of these men, not only as captives, but as witnesses. Britain initially held many of them. But as the war expanded and prisoner numbers increased, the United States offered something no European nation could: space, security, and distance from the battlefield. By mid-1943, the US had committed to housing large numbers of Axis POWs on its own soil. Camps were established across the country, from the Mississippi Delta to the plains of Texas, from the forests of Maryland to the deserts of Arizona. For senior officers and generals, specific locations were chosen for both discretion and control. The journey itself was disorienting. After interrogation in Europe, selected prisoners were moved under guard to ports, then placed aboard troop ships crossing the Atlantic. The voyage took days, sometimes weeks. They traveled under strict security, yet without the chaos that defined most wartime transport in Europe. No bombing, no blackouts at sea, no scarcity of food or water. When they arrived, the contrast sharpened. The United States they encountered was mobilized, but intact. Rail networks functioned. Ports operated at full capacity. Cities glowed at night. Factories ran in shifts without having been reduced to rubble. Civilians moved freely. Shops were stocked. Fuel flowed. For German generals who had spent years commanding in landscapes of ruin, this was not merely surprising. It was destabilizing. They had been taught to believe that the enemy's strength was exaggerated, that America's distance from the battlefield would weaken its resolve, that material abundance could not replace hardened experience. Yet everything they were about to see suggested the opposite. And as they were processed into American custody, escorted through clean camps built specifically for them, the question that formed quietly in their minds was not about defeat or victory, but about how wrong their understanding of the war had been from the beginning. That question would only deepen once they began to truly observe the world behind the wire. The first lesson the German generals learned in America did not come from an interrogator. It came from routine. They were counted, registered, assigned quarters. The process was methodical, efficient, and notably calm. There were no shouted orders, no theatrical displays of authority. Guards followed procedure. Paperwork was completed. Rules were explained clearly, sometimes through interpreters, sometimes through officers who spoke German with practiced ease. For men accustomed to absolute hierarchy and constant tension, the atmosphere felt almost unreal. American POW camps were built with a specific purpose. They were not improvised holding areas. They were planned installations, constructed according to standardized designs and adjusted for climate and location. For officers and generals, accommodations were separate from enlisted compounds. Barracks were heated in winter, ventilated in summer. Beds had mattresses. There were latrines with running water. Medical facilities were functional and staffed. The Geneva Convention was not treated as a suggestion. It was enforced policy. Officers were not required to perform manual labor. They received regular meals calibrated to U.S. Army rations. Red Cross parcels arrived consistently. They were allowed correspondence with family through monitored mail. Religious services were permitted. Books and newspapers, carefully selected, circulated through the camps. For German generals who had seen Soviet POWs starve by the thousands, and who knew how Allied prisoners were treated inside the Reich, this consistency created a quiet unease. Nothing about the system matched the image they had been given. Security was present, but not oppressive. Watchtowers ringed the compounds. Fences were solid. Escape was clearly futile, not because of brutality, but because of geography. Beyond the wire stretched thousands of kilometers of unfamiliar territory. No sympathetic population, no safe borders. The guards knew this. The prisoners sensed it. As days turned into weeks, routines became predictable. Morning roll calls, meals served on time, periods of recreation, reading, walking. Conversations among officers who had once commanded armies and now debated maps they would never again influence. But it was what lay beyond the camps that unsettled them most. Many facilities were located near rail lines, farms, or small towns. From within the wire, prisoners could hear freight trains passing day and night. Long, heavy, uninterrupted. They could see civilian traffic moving freely, trucks hauling goods without escort, farmers delivering produce, construction continuing without pause. The scale was difficult to ignore. In Germany, rail lines were constant targets. Trains moved under camouflage, delays were routine, fuel shortages dictated schedules. In America, movement felt effortless. The war had not reached the homeland in the same way. Industry was not surviving under bombardment. It was expanding. Some generals were transported between camps for administrative reasons or intelligence purposes. These movements offered brief, controlled glimpses of the wider country, guarded bus rides, train transfers, passing views through curtained windows. What they saw contradicted years of briefings. Cities functioned. Factories operated at full output. Shipyards along the coasts produced vessels at rates no European power could match. There were no visible signs of collapse, no ration panic, no crumbling infrastructure. Even with millions of men overseas, American society appeared organized, confident, and, most disturbing of all, comfortable. The contrast was not lost on them. Inside the camps, American officers maintained professional distance. There was no triumphalism, no attempt to humiliate. Conversations, when they occurred, were measured, polite, sometimes almost cordial. This, too, was unsettling. It denied the prisoners the comfort of hostility. For intelligence officers, this environment was intentional. The United States had learned that information was often extracted not through pressure, but through patience. A general who felt respected might talk. One who felt safe might reflect aloud. And one who was allowed to observe freely might draw his own conclusions without being prompted. Some camps were even designed with listening devices embedded in walls and furnishings. Conversations between German officers were quietly recorded. Their private assessments of Hitler, of the war, of America itself, were catalogued with meticulous care. What emerged from those recordings was not defiance, but disorientation. The generals spoke of production figures they could not reconcile, of logistics that seemed limitless, of a society mobilized without appearing strained. Slowly, the language of certainty gave way to doubt. The realization crept in without announcement. This enemy was not improvising. It had prepared, it had planned, and it had done so on a scale Germany could neither match nor disrupt. Behind the wire, far from the front lines, the war revealed itself in a form these men had never been allowed to see. And as observation turned into reflection, the shock began to take on different dimensions, human, strategic, moral, each cutting deeper than the last. For German generals, captivity in America was not defined by fear. It was defined by silence. There were no artillery barrages in the distance, no hurried staff meetings, no collapsing fronts to manage. Instead, there were long hours inside barracks where the mind had space to wander. Men who had spent decades inside rigid command structures were left alone with their thoughts. In these moments, disbelief surfaced not as outrage, but as fatigue. They spoke quietly among themselves, about the quality of the food, about medical care that functioned without improvisation, about guards who followed rules instead of moods. None of these details mattered individually. Together, they formed a picture that contradicted everything they had been told. Several generals later admitted that this environment was more destabilizing than open hostility would have been. There was no enemy hatred to push against, no cruelty to justify defiance. The calm forced reflection. For some, the realization arrived slowly. For others, it struck immediately. The war they believed they were fighting, against a fragile, divided opponent, was an illusion. America did not look brittle. It looked prepared. The tactical angle, the weight of production. Professional soldiers think in numbers, in supply columns, in replacement rates, in fuel tonnage and rail capacity. From inside American camps, German generals began to mentally recalculate the war. They listened to trains passing day and night. They counted the length of freight convoys. They compared this movement to the strained logistics of the Eastern Front. In Germany, divisions fought for fuel allocations. In America, fuel moved without visible restraint. Reports from Europe had spoken of American tanks, aircraft, and trucks appearing in growing numbers. Now the source of that abundance was visible. Factories operating beyond the reach of bombers, supported by uninterrupted infrastructure. The generals understood what this meant. A modern war could not be won on bravery alone. It was won by sustained output, by the ability to lose equipment and replace it faster than the enemy, by training systems that absorbed losses and produced new units without collapse. From their perspective, Germany had been fighting with diminishing margins. America was fighting with expanding ones. This realization carried a professional weight that ideology could not counter. The enemy narrative angle, collapse of the myth Nazi propaganda, had been explicit about America. It described a society weakened by internal division, a population unwilling to sacrifice, a military reliant on machines but lacking discipline. According to this narrative, American soldiers would fight poorly once casualties mounted. The generals had repeated these assumptions in briefings. Some had believed them. Others had simply accepted them as useful. America behind the wire destroyed that narrative. Discipline was visible, not theatrical, but procedural. Guards followed regulations without improvisation. Logistics operated without chaos. Civilians appeared engaged but not desperate. Racial segregation existed, and the generals noticed it, but it did not produce the immediate collapse they had been led to expect. More importantly, American soldiers were not demoralized. They rotated, they trained, they returned to duty. The myth of American softness did not survive prolonged observation. This was not a nation fighting a short war. It was a society organized for duration. And in quiet conversations, some generals began to articulate what could no longer be denied. The enemy they faced had not been understood, not by intelligence services, not by political leadership, not even by parts of the military itself. That realization did not come with drama, it came with resignation. And as these human, tactical, and narrative shocks settled in, deeper questions followed, about leadership, morality, and the purpose of obedience. Those questions would define the next stage of their captivity. Captivity removed distance. For years, German generals had interpreted orders through layers of staff work, ideology, and necessity. In America, stripped of authority and insulated from immediate danger, they began to examine decisions they had once defended without hesitation. The question surfaced quietly: had they been led or used? Recorded conversations reveal a gradual shift in tone. Early remarks still referenced loyalty and duty. Over time, these gave way to analytical critique. Strategic miscalculations were discussed openly. The invasion of the Soviet Union, the refusal to retreat at Stalingrad, the obsession with symbolic ground over operational reality. Hitler's leadership, once treated as unquestionable, was increasingly described as rigid and detached. Generals spoke of interference, of orders issued without regard for conditions on the ground. They compared this to what they now observed in America: delegation, standardized doctrine, adaptability. The contrast was painful. For professional officers trained in operational art, the realization that their defeat was not inevitable, but shaped by leadership failure, cut deeply. The moral angle, the weight of comparison, perhaps the most uncomfortable angle, was moral. These men knew how prisoners were treated under German authority, especially in the East. They had seen starvation, forced labor, systematic neglect. Some had protested quietly. Others had looked away. Most had rationalized it as necessity. In America, those justifications became harder to maintain. They were fed adequately, protected by law, allowed dignity within captivity, not as an act of kindness, but as policy, as doctrine, as an expression of how the enemy understood war. This did not produce gratitude. It produced shame, not for all, but for enough that the contrast became impossible to ignore. The realization that Germany had lost not only militarily, but morally, emerged slowly. It was not spoken loudly. It did not need to be. The war was being fought by two systems. One relied on coercion and fear, the other on procedure and production. Observing that difference from inside a PW camp carried a weight no battlefield report could convey. The intelligence angle, observation as extraction. The Americans did not press these realizations. They let them develop. Facilities like Fort Hunt in Virginia were designed specifically to observe high-value prisoners. Rooms were wired. Conversations were recorded, not to entrap, but to listen. What the intelligence officers captured was not resistance. It was analysis. German generals discussed the war honestly when they believed no one was listening. They assessed Allied strategy with clarity. They acknowledged German weaknesses with precision. Some even speculated on post-war reconstruction and accountability. This information proved invaluable, not because it revealed secrets, but because it confirmed conclusions already forming within Allied planning circles. The enemy knew he was beaten. And as leadership doubts, moral comparisons, and intelligence assessments converged, the generals reached a turning point, not a dramatic confession, but a quiet acceptance. The war, as they understood it, was already over. What remained was the moment when that realization became undeniable. The turning point did not arrive with an announcement. It arrived through accumulation. For many German generals held in the United States, the decisive realization formed during controlled exposures to the wider American war machine. Moments when observation replaced speculation. In 1944, select high-ranking prisoners were transported between facilities for administrative or intelligence purposes. These movements were routine on paper. In reality, they became windows. A general might be escorted by rail from one camp to another, guarded but not hidden. The train moved through open countryside, through industrial corridors, past rail yards filled with rolling stock that seemed endless in number, tank cars, flatbeds stacked with steel, boxcars marked for every branch of the military. The trains did not stop because of air raids. They did not wait for repairs. They moved on schedule. For men who had watched German logistics collapse under bombing and fuel shortages, this was more than impressive. It was decisive. In some instances, prisoners passed near manufacturing centers. Detroit, Pittsburgh, or the industrial belts feeding coastal shipyards. They saw smokestacks active around the clock. Workers changing shifts, not evacuating shelters. Power grids functioning without interruption. This was not emergency production. This was sustained output. American officers did not explain what the prisoners were seeing. They did not need to. The scale spoke for itself. One general later noted in post-war interrogation summaries that Germany had underestimated not American ingenuity, but American endurance. The United States was not fighting a desperate war. It was fighting a long one, and it was built for it. Inside the camps, news filtered in carefully. Newspapers were censored but factual. Allied landings in Normandy, the breakout from the beachhead, the liberation of Paris. Each report was understated, almost clinical. There was no triumphal language. That restraint made the information harder to dismiss, As summer turned to autumn in 1944, the pace accelerated. Allied forces advanced across France. German units fell back toward the Rhine. Fuel shortages crippled counterattacks. Replacement troops arrived undertrained. Equipment losses mounted. Then came the Ardennes offensive. For a brief moment, some generals allowed themselves a familiar hope. The plan was bold. The terrain favored surprise. Perhaps, they thought, the enemy could still be shaken. From behind the wire, they followed the reports. The offensive achieved initial gains. Then it stalled. Fuel ran out. American resistance stiffened. Air power returned once the weather cleared. Within weeks, Germany's last strategic reserve was spent. The silence inside the camps after that news was different. Conversations slowed. Arguments ended quickly. Maps were no longer debated. The generals understood what had happened. Germany had wagered everything and lost. What followed was not despair. It was clarity. The American war machine they had been observing was now fully engaged across Europe. Its momentum was visible. Its reach undeniable. The gap between what Germany could produce and what America could deploy had become unbridgeable. This was the moment when disbelief gave way to acceptance, not of guilt, not of ideology, but of outcome. The war was no longer something that could be influenced by courage, sacrifice, or tactical brilliance. It had become a matter of mathematics, and the numbers were no longer in doubt. As winter settled in again and the camps grew quieter, the generals began to speak in different terms, not about how to win, but about what would come after. That shift marked the true climax of their experience. But the psychological reckoning was not yet complete. After the failure of the Ardennes offensive, time changed character. Days inside the camps felt longer, not because conditions worsened, but because certainty disappeared. The German generals were no longer measuring hours against orders or fronts. They were measuring them against inevitability. The war's trajectory could now be traced without emotion. By January 1945, Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly through Poland. The Red Army reached the Oder River within striking distance of Berlin. In the west, Allied armies crossed the Rhine. German defenses fractured under pressure they could not absorb. Inside American camps, this information arrived without commentary. Newspapers reported advances, maps were updated, dates accumulated. The generals did the rest themselves. They calculated distances, estimated remaining divisions, counted the absence of reserves. For professional officers, the exercise was familiar. This time, it led only in one direction. Some attempted to preserve formality. They maintained daily routines. They wore uniforms neatly. They continued to discuss military theory. But beneath that discipline, something fundamental had shifted. The war had moved beyond them. What broke the last internal resistance was not a single event, but a comparison they could no longer avoid. Germany was fighting for survival with bombed factories, fragmented transport, and a shrinking workforce. America was fighting overseas while its homeland expanded production, improved logistics, and trained fresh formations without interruption. The imbalance was total. In recorded conversations, generals began to speak with unusual candor, not about betrayal, but about misjudgment. They acknowledged that Germany had entered a war it could not sustain, that the assumption of quick victories had replaced long-term planning. That ideological certainty had overridden operational reality. Some expressed anger, others resignation. A few spoke of relief that the responsibility of command had been removed before the final collapse. There was no dramatic renunciation of loyalty, no collective moral awakening. These were professional soldiers, not philosophers. But there was a quiet admission that the system they served had failed them. The environment in America made denial impossible. They saw a nation that mobilized without consuming itself, a military that replaced losses without panic, a command structure that allowed adaptation instead of punishing it. In that contrast, the last defenses fell. By early spring, The generals spoke openly of defeat as a certainty rather than a possibility. The only remaining variables were time and destruction. When news of Hitler's suicide arrived in late April 1945, it did not produce shock inside the camps. It produced confirmation. The war ended in Europe, slowly emptied. The broader consequences of that understanding began to take form, not just for individuals, but for how the conflict itself would be remembered. As the last German generals departed American custody, the camps themselves faded quietly back into the landscape. Barracks were dismantled or repurposed. Watchtowers came down. What had once been a controlled microcosm of the war dissolved into memory. But the impact of what occurred inside those camps did not disappear. The recordings, reports, and interrogations compiled during captivity became part of a larger Allied effort to understand how modern wars were fought and lost. German generals, once architects of blitzkrieg, were now sources of retrospective analysis. Their candid assessments of failure helped shape post-war military doctrine, particularly in the early years of NATO planning. Yet their most valuable contribution was not tactical detail. It was perspective. They had seen the war from both sides, commanding within a system driven by ideology and scarcity, then observing one defined by procedure and abundance. This dual view informed Allied understanding of why Germany collapsed so completely once its momentum was broken. The American experience of handling high-ranking POWs also left a legacy. It demonstrated that intelligence could be extracted without coercion. That observation, patience, and lawful treatment could yield insight more reliably than force. These lessons influenced later U.S. military and intelligence practices, even as the Cold War introduced new tensions and contradictions. For the generals themselves, history was less forgiving. Some attempted to separate their professional competence from the regime they served. Others acknowledged complicity more openly. A few retreated into silence. None escaped association with the war they had helped wage. What united their accounts was an unexpected theme: surprise. Not at defeat alone, but at the nature of the enemy. America, they concluded, had not won solely through battlefield brilliance. It had won by creating a system capable of sustaining effort over time without self-destruction. Its strength lay not in moments of heroism, but in consistency. This assessment challenged older European assumptions about warfare. It suggested that future conflicts would be decided less by decisive battles and more by logistics, production, and institutional resilience. The German generals had glimpsed that future from behind wire fences. Their disbelief had evolved into understanding, their understanding into acknowledgement, and their acknowledgement into a quiet historical record that contradicted the myths they once upheld. As the world moved forward, rebuilding and realigning, those lessons remained embedded in doctrine, policy, and memory. What remained to be addressed was not how the war was won, but what it revealed about power, ideology, and the limits of command. The German generals arrived in America carrying certainty. They left with something more difficult to bear: clarity. Their captivity did not confront them with humiliation or spectacle. It confronted them with order, with a society at war that functioned without collapse. Later, for the German generals in American captivity, the conclusion felt strangely distant. There were no surrender ceremonies, no dramatic handovers, just official notices, routine announcements, a formal end to a conflict they had already processed internally. The disbelief that had marked their arrival was gone. What remained was understanding. They had not been defeated by individual battles alone. They had been defeated by a system, one capable of sustaining war at a scale and duration Germany had never truly prepared to confront. And with that realization settled, the question shifted once more. What would follow this understanding, both for them and for the world they would return to? Victory in Europe did not immediately change life inside the American POW camps. The routines remained. Roll calls continued. Meals were served on schedule. Guards stayed at their posts. But the purpose of captivity had shifted. For the German generals, the war was over. What remained was accounting. In the weeks following Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied authorities reassessed every high-ranking prisoner. Files were reviewed. Recorded conversations were analyzed one final time. Intelligence officers prepared summaries that would inform post-war occupation policy, denazification efforts, and future military planning. Some generals were questioned again, not aggressively, but thoroughly. Their assessments of the war, their evaluations of German command failures, and their views on Allied strategy were documented. These interviews were calm, almost academic. The information was no longer urgent. It was historical. Repatriation did not happen immediately. Europe was in ruins. Transport networks were damaged. Political structures were uncertain. Many German officers remained in American custody well into late 1945 and 1946. During this period, the contrast that had defined their captivity remained visible. While Germany faced shortages, displacement, and uncertainty, the United States transitioned smoothly from wartime to peacetime footing. Factories retooled. Soldiers demobilized in stages. Civilian life adjusted without collapse. For the generals, this reinforced the lesson they had already absorbed. Some were transferred back to Europe under Allied supervision. Others were held for longer periods due to suspected involvement in war crimes or for continued intelligence value. Not all would return to civilian life quickly. Some never would. Those who did return encountered a country transformed. Germany was divided, occupied, its cities shattered, its institutions dismantled or discredited. The military they had served no longer existed. The uniforms they once wore carried a weight they could not escape. In later years, several former generals recorded memoirs or participated in historical interviews. Their tone was often restrained, professional, analytical. They rarely spoke of American guards or camp conditions in emotional terms. Instead, they emphasized what they had observed: organization, scale, predictability. They acknowledged, sometimes indirectly, that captivity in the United States had revealed aspects of the war that front-line command had concealed. The shock had not been cruelty. It had been normalcy. That realization shaped how some of them approached post-war military theory. A number contributed to Western military studies during the early Cold War, advising on Soviet tactics and operational planning. Their insights were valued, but their authority was no longer unquestioned. They had become witnesses, not commanders. The war had ended not with their surrender, but with their understanding. And as repatriation progressed and camps slowly, with a military system that absorbed loss without desperation, and with an enemy whose strength had been misunderstood, not because it was hidden, but because it had been dismissed. Behind the wire, far from the battlefield, the war revealed its true nature. It was not decided by brilliance alone, or by courage or by ideology shouted loudly enough. It was decided by endurance, by logistics, by institutions capable of sustaining pressure without consuming themselves. For men trained to believe that war turned on decisive moments, this was a sobering lesson. Their disbelief was not rooted in kindness or comfort. It was rooted in contradiction. America did not resemble the enemy they had prepared to defeat. And once that contradiction became visible, denial was no longer possible. History often remembers wars through their battles, through dates and maps and casualty figures. But the experience of these generals reminds us that wars are also shaped in quieter places, where assumptions collapse, where narratives fail, and where reality is finally observed without filters. In those moments, power is revealed not as force alone, but as capacity. The capacity to plan beyond the next season, to replace what is lost, to adapt without fear. That, more than any single battle, decided the outcome of the war they fought. And for the men who witnessed it from captivity, the greatest shock was not defeat, but the realization that it had been inevitable long before the shooting stopped.